America's hidden legacy, the women trapped by inbreeding. When we think of inbreeding, our minds often drift to European royal families or ancient dynasties where blood purity was the currency of power. But the truth is, the United States, despite its youth as a nation, holds its own dark legacy of genetic entrapment. From isolated mountain communities to fringe religious sects and long-forgotten colonial settlements, the shadow of inbreeding has haunted certain corners of American history. In this chapter, we peel back the layers on the lives of American women born into these environments, often hidden, oppressed, and biologically burdened by generations of incestuous tradition. These are not just stories of genetics. They're stories of survival, stigma, and systems that fail to protect. Lorraine Whitaker, the face of modern inbreeding in Appalachia. Deep in the hollers of rural West Virginia lies the town of Odd, a name that feels strangely prophetic given what would one day be uncovered there. Lorraine Whitaker is perhaps the most infamous American example of extreme inbreeding in the modern age. Born into the Whitaker family, a clan whose lineage has become a haunting symbol of generational isolation, Lorraine's life is a testimony to what happens when society turns a blind eye for too long. Lorraine was both daughter to and mother of multiple children fathered through incest. In the Whitaker family, the lines of relation had become so blurred that outsiders struggled to map the family tree because it wasn't a tree at all. It was a circle, looping back on itself with each generation. The impact on Lorraine was staggering. Not only did she grow up in profound poverty, but she suffered severe cognitive limitations, some attributed to the generational genetic compression her family endured. She gave birth to Timmy Whitaker, a man who became a symbol of this haunting legacy, often referred to as the most genetically compromised person in America. His severe developmental disabilities, nonverbal communication, and behavioral tics shocked many who first saw the documentary footage capturing their lives. But behind the shock lay something far worse. Society had allowed this to happen. Lorraine's existence wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror reflecting what happens in the forgotten shadows of a country that prides itself on progress. While the Whitaker family was exploited for shock media, the deeper tragedy was Lorraine herself, a woman born with no choice, trapped in a cycle from which escape was never really possible. Mary Collett. The mountain matriarch's silent scandal. Before the internet, before highways cut through the hills, there were women like Mary Collett. Born in the late 19th century in the Appalachian highlands of eastern Kentucky, Mary was raised in a world both beautiful and cruel. Her family, deeply isolated by geography and culture, followed a practice that was whispered but rarely questioned: marrying kin. Mary's parents were first cousins. Her grandparents were related too. By the time she had children of her own, the genetic pool had become dangerously shallow. Outwardly, Mary seemed a typical mountain woman, stern, hard-working, and deeply rooted in her land. But tragedy followed her children like a shadow. 3 died before the age of 5. One daughter was born blind. Another never learned to speak. In Mary's town, this was simply accepted. In a place where travel was rare and marriages were often arranged within known families, it wasn't unusual to find cousins, sometimes even siblings, wed under the quiet approval of family elders. The biological consequences were tragic, but hidden beneath layers of shame and silence. Though Mary never left the mountains, her legacy lives on in medical case studies and genetic research on isolated populations. She never sought infamy, but in many ways, she became the face of Appalachia's genetic reckoning. One woman among many who bore the weight of her ancestors' choices and paid the price in blood. Sarah Jane Fulkerson, the Mormon refugee. In the deserts of Utah, the name Fulkerson isn't remembered fondly. Sarah Jane Fulkerson was born into a splinter group of polygamous Mormons in the late 1800s. Her parents were third cousins, but her family's practices went far deeper than that. Her grandfather had fathered children with 2 of his nieces. Her own father married one of his first cousins. In Sarah's world, this was considered not taboo, but divine. At just 14, Sarah was married to a 52-year-old prophet who had already married 3 of her distant cousins. She bore him 6 children. Only 2 survived infancy. By her early 20s, she was a widow, her husband poisoned by a rival sect. Left with 2 sickly sons and no inheritance, she fled the compound and resettled in Idaho under a new name. What makes Sarah's story so chilling isn't just the inbreeding, it's the religious justification for it. In her sect, purity meant proximity, genetically and spiritually. Women like Sarah were prized not for intelligence or health, but for bloodline. The result was a closed-loop community rife with congenital diseases, stunted growth, and psychological instability. Sarah tried to rebuild her life, even remarrying a schoolteacher and living out her later years in relative peace. But 2 of her daughters would go on to marry into the same sect she had escaped, continuing the cycle she thought she had broken. History, it seemed, was inescapable, even in America. Clara Thompson, The Tragedy of the Blue Fugates. Among the strangest cases of American inbreeding sits the haunting story of the Fugate family from Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, infamously known as the Blue People. Clara Thompson, born in 1920 and descended directly from this line, was the last woman to carry both the Fugate name and the genetic condition that made headlines around the world. Clara had methemoglobinemia, a rare condition causing blue-tinged skin due to reduced oxygen in the blood. While not deadly, the condition was visual proof of genetic closeness made possible by nearly 200 years of intermarriage in a secluded valley. Clara was a direct product of generations of cousin marriages, often between first cousins, with no genetic input from outside populations. She was ashamed of her appearance. Villagers told tales of her being cursed or touched by the supernatural. As a child, she was mocked. As an adult, she rarely left home. Her skin was not the only indicator. Clara struggled with breathing, fatigue, and had a cleft palate. Unlike others in this chapter, Clara had access to treatment. Dr. Madison Cawane eventually administered methylene blue, which temporarily returned her skin to a pink hue. But she refused it after a while. She said the blue was part of her family. She died in 1985, unmarried and childless. Some say she ended the line. Others say descendants still live in the mountains, hiding their color and their legacy. Kimberly Colt, America's modern incest catastrophe. In the early 2000s, authorities discovered a disturbing scene in rural New South Wales, Australia. But at the center of the international headlines was Kimberly Colt, an American-born woman and member of a multi-generational family that had fled the U.S. decades earlier. The Colt family became synonymous with modern incest. Kimberly was born to a mother and uncle. Her grandparents were siblings. She gave birth to several children, many of whom showed clear signs of severe genetic disorders, missing limbs, speech impairments, and cognitive delays. Australian authorities were horrified by the scale. 4 generations of incest, dozens of children, and no clear sense of who fathered whom. Though Kimberly lived in Australia, her story is deeply American. Her ancestors fled the Midwest, escaping legal scrutiny. They formed an isolated cult-like compound abroad, but their roots were planted in rural Missouri and Indiana, where the first instances of inbreeding occurred and were ignored. What Kimberly represents is a chilling truth. Even in modern industrialized societies like America, incest can fester in hidden pockets, growing more grotesque with each generation. Her story was the culmination of 50 years of silence, a biological disaster that was born on American soil. Ruth Ann Bishop, The Amish Secret. No one dared speak to the outside world. The Amish seemed like a community preserved in amber, peaceful, hard-working, God-fearing. But within the order, especially among the more insular Old Order sects, a different truth often lingers beneath the surface, one that women like Ruth Ann Bishop bore silently. Ruth Ann was born into a small Pennsylvania Amish village in the early 1900s. Her family tree was more like a family knot. Her grandparents were second cousins, and her parents were first cousins once removed. Marriage outside the order was not only discouraged, it was forbidden. The community's tight gene pool made children like Ruth Ann more common than outsiders would imagine. Pale-skinned, with trembling limbs, weak hearts, and developmental challenges. Ruth Ann herself was known as the quiet girl, not by choice but due to her limited speech capacity. By 14, she was married to a man 9 years her senior. By 15, she was pregnant. The child was born with Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, a genetic disorder associated with polydactyly, dwarfism, and congenital heart problems, strikingly common in Amish communities. She would give birth to 6 children. 4 survived. 2 of them were born with similar disorders. Yet within the Amish culture, this wasn't discussed, not openly. These were seen as God's will, not genetic consequence. Ruth Ann died at 48, having never once left her county, her story trapped in the soft silence of religious compliance. Eunice Stanley, the Puritan legacy of incest. In 17th century Massachusetts, the Stanley family was among the first Puritan settlers to establish a foothold in the New World. But what history books often omit is the way isolation and religious rigidity created the perfect storm for inbreeding. Eunice Stanley, born in 1689, was a direct descendant of a line that married first cousins across 3 generations, all in the name of maintaining a pure covenant bloodline. Eunice was strikingly frail from birth. Chronic fevers, poor vision, and bone malformations plagued her. Her diaries, preserved in historical archives, reveal a woman painfully aware of her difference, describing a soul trapped in a body God miswrought. By 18, she was married to her second cousin, an arrangement brokered by her father, who believed mixing bloodlines with outsiders risked their spiritual lineage. She died in childbirth at 23. Her child survived but lived just 6 years, likely from the same congenital frailty that haunted the family. Historians often treat colonial America as a time of moral clarity, but the story of Eunice and others like her shows a more complex truth: how even the most devout communities could fall victim to biological collapse under the weight of religious purity. Rebecca Becky Keene, the Ozarks' unspoken reality. In the deeply forested regions of the Missouri Ozarks, poverty and isolation have forged a world almost untouched by modern life. Here lived Rebecca Becky Keene, born in 1949, a woman whose ancestry reads like a closed loop. Her family had lived in the same county for over 150 years, with few outsiders ever marrying in. Becky was born with microcephaly, a condition resulting in a smaller brain and head size. Her speech was delayed, she walked late, struggled with fine motor skills, and never learned to read. She was one of 7 children, 4 of whom had similar conditions. Locals referred to the Keenes as the touched family, a euphemism for inbred without saying the word. Becky's mother had married her own cousin. Her father's family had done the same for 3 generations. The family lived in near total seclusion, surviving off the land and avoiding doctors, schools, and social services. Becky never married. She died at 56, alone and undocumented. Her life is now referenced in rural medical case studies on genetic bottlenecking in underserved American populations. She may not have known her story, but her body became proof of it. Daisy Deedon, the silence of the swamps. Born in the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin of Louisiana in the early 20th century, Daisy Deedon was as much a product of the swamp as the cypress trees and crocodiles. Her Cajun family had lived off-grid for generations, intermarrying with cousins, second cousins, and occasionally even unacknowledged siblings. Daisy was born with fused fingers and a cleft palate, a condition her mother also shared. What sets Daisy's story apart is the folklore that rose around her. Locals claimed she was a witch, her blue eyes and webbed feet proof of the old magic in the blood. In truth, it was simply biology, unchecked and recycled through too few ancestors. Daisy never went to school, she never left the basin. At 19, she gave birth to twins, fathered, it is believed, by her half-brother. One of the twins died before their first birthday. The other lived, but was deaf and mute. Daisy spent the remainder of her life fishing, raising chickens, and avoiding strangers. She died in 1981, but her image still haunts regional legends, even as the truth of her life was far more tragic than mystical. Abigail Loomis, the face of American eugenics. Abigail Loomis was born in Connecticut in 1903, a product of one of the most publicly documented cases of degenerate heredity in American history. Her family had been studied by eugenicists who used them to justify forced sterilizations and institutionalization throughout the early 20th century. Abigail's father and mother were uncle and niece. Both were born with mild cognitive impairments. Abigail, however, showed more severe signs. limited verbal capacity, severe scoliosis, and seizures. The family became part of a state medical study seeking to prove that traits like feeble-mindedness were inherited, and more importantly, preventable through sterilization. Abigail was institutionalized at 13 and sterilized at 15, never knowing what the procedure truly meant. She lived another 47 years in a state-run facility, dying in 1965. She never married, never had children, and never left the system that labeled her defective and made decisions on her behalf. Though her story was co-opted by proponents of eugenics, Abigail's life stands as a grim example of what happens when science, government, and prejudice intersect. In her case, inbreeding wasn't just a family secret, it was a state weapon.